Welcome to the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I'm your host, Nicole Davidson, and in this podcast, we'll explore the art and science of negotiation in real-world situations. Whether you're negotiating a business deal, asking for a raise, or trying to resolve a conflict with a colleague or loved one, negotiation is an essential skill that can help you achieve your goals and build better relationships. Through interviews with experts, real-life stories, and practical tips and techniques, we'll deep dive into the strategies and tactics that can make you a better negotiator. From understanding your own negotiation style, to reading body language, handling difficult conversations, and overcoming common challenges, this podcast will give you the tools you need to negotiate with confidence and achieve your objectives. So whether you're a seasoned negotiator looking to refine your skills or someone who's new to the game, join us as we explore the world of negotiation in real life. In this episode of Negotiation in Real Life, I speak with Glenn Poulos. Glenn is the co-founder, vice president and general manager of Gap Wireless Inc., a leading distributor for the mobile broadband, wireless and test and measurement equipment markets in Canada. With over 3 decades of experience in sales, he's spent thousands of hours in the field or on the phone with customers, working with salespeople to help create several very successful companies. In our discussion today, we speak about Glenn's story of selling his business of 15 years to a VC firm, the power of add-backs in a business sale, the importance of using a business broker, considerations in what to take as payment in a business sale, the power of journaling your negotiations, the importance of leaning into difficulties rather than running away, tips for getting in front of customers and staying in front of them, and much, much more. I hope you enjoy this episode of Negotiation in Real Life. So today I'm delighted to welcome to Negotiation in Real Life, Glenn Poulos, all the way from Canada. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Nicole. Happy to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Now, Glenn, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the negotiations that you've had, particularly in a sales context. But before we get into all of that detail, perhaps you'd like to tell our listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay. My name's Glenn Poulos. I'm the vice president and general manager of Gap Wireless. We sell high-tech, high-ticket items in the telecom business, primarily in Canada, a little bit in the US as well. But we help build the wireless network. We don't actually build it. We sell the equipment to the companies that build wireless networks. So as we like to say, there's a lot of wires in wireless, and we sell wires. And so I've been doing that for about 15 years. I'm now an employee of Gap Wireless. I was the owner with my business partner, but we sold the company a year ago, and we signed on with the private equity firm to stay for a few years and help them with some other companies that they're working on with integrating into the business. And so now I've gone from owner, entrepreneur to employee, which is an interesting situation in and of itself. So
I can imagine, and I'm guessing that there were probably a few interesting negotiations in that process of selling out to a VC as well. So that may come up as we go through the discussions.
For sure. That is for sure.
Fantastic. Now, I know you've also written a book, and you've got your book, Never Sit in the Lobby, 57 Winning Sales Factors to Grow a Company and Build a Career Selling. And that's been based on your career in sales and some of the experiences that you've had. What's one of the negotiations that really stands out in your mind as something that's been a really big learning experience for you in developing your negotiation skills?
Yeah, so there's been a couple. So one that sort of stands out that worked out kind of well, one that kind of worked out to the contrary, right? But again, you can learn from your mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I mean, obviously, I sold the business a year ago, so that's probably the biggest negotiation that I'd gone through in my life, and going from an owner operator with myself, my business partner, 15 years running a business, to, working with, a very well-established private equity firm from Washington, D.C. with many funds. And, they have a lot of very skilled people on their side of the table. And we did have a broker helping us, which, represented our best interest. But that was probably one of the most, the biggest learning experiences I've had. And the specifics of it were, establishing what is and isn't your value, right? Because when you're, you think, kind of like when you're selling your house or whatever, you think, oh, my house is worth, $500K or something like that, right? But, and some people are thinking, well, I put a hot tub in the back, and, people are like, well, I don't care about a hot tub. I'm going to throw that out. Your house is still worth $500K. But when you're selling a business, there's a lot of, if I can use that as a joke, there's a lot of hot tubs when you're selling the business. There's a lot of subtle parts of the business that you have to both determine and then quantify and then justify the value of those things, where, because what they're doing is they're paying you a multiple on your EBITDA, right? And so, your raw EBITDA is basically fairly easy to calculate, and as a function of your sales, your gross margins minus your expenses, and and what have you. It's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. But what you don't really know when you're just sort of running the business day in and day out is all the add backs that you can do when you're selling your business, right? So, to give the audience an example, let's say, you put in a big ERP system the year before, and it costs $250,000 to buy the software, to pay for the programmers, all the customization, the training. That's a one-time charge, right? And so that would normally, year in or year out, with myself and my partner, we would just take that off our EBITDA, and call it a day. But when we got into the negotiation, we said, hey, no, we're adding that back because you're getting the value of that. We're not.
That's right? Because you'd be depreciating that over a couple of years.
Right.
Whereas they will get that benefit. Yeah. And how did that come up for you? Because obviously, from the sounds of it, it's not something that you would have thought about before. And it would be easy for someone to miss the ability to add back something like that. How did it come up for you that you knew to do that?
The broker that was representing our interests, which is not unlike a real estate agent, that helps you to get the best deal when you're buying or selling a home, right? It basically explained the process of add backs and said, look, you have to go in and find anything that's a one-time charge, anything non-recurring, and there's a list of host of things that qualify as add backs. And for instance, you might have taken a corporate retreat trip with your partner to, some Caribbean destination or whatever, which you might think is an add back, but it's not an add back, right? And so they're like basically just, and so we literally had to go through every expense in the last couple of years and literally look at every single dime that went out of the business and say to ourselves, is this a recurring, non-recurring? Is this qualify potentially or as an add back? And then later we had to justify and negotiate why they should be add backs and why they shouldn't be, right?
So you're basically looking at, is this expense for value that will be retained by the new buyer?
Exactly.
Or has it been used up already at this point? But I think what really stands out to me there is, and I speak to small business owners particularly, who are often reluctant to pay someone to come in as a broker. Because, brokers are not cheap. There's a cost that's involved. But what I'm seeing here is that the benefit of having that expert is that they know about these things. If you hadn't had that broker, not knowing about this add back process would have cost you a lot of money.
It would have. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and of course, everyone, when you're sort of selling your life's work, your baby or whatever, you're thinking like, why would I want to pay these people? Usually it's 5% in case the audience is wondering. It's pretty much, sometimes there's a range. If it's a smaller transaction might be a little bit higher on the small end and then drop down if they get you a higher number. But I mean, in our case, it was just 5, and that's pretty much standard in the industry, which is not unlike when you sell your house too, right?
Yeah.
And so I would highly recommend no one ever considers doing this kind of a transaction without a broker, even though it's a hard check to write. But I can assure you that the broker will get you the 5% back in terms of the they pay for themselves, right? So as I like to say about salespeople, like salespeople sometimes say to me in interviews, "Oh, you can't afford me," and I said, "I don't need to afford you," and they're like, "Well, why not?" And I'm like, "Well, because a good salesman pays for themselves. I only need to afford bad salespeople, right? So do you, are you good or bad, right? Because if you're as good as you say you are, you're free, right? Yeah. And and so I highly recommend people consider brokers. And the other thing is that they create some of these persuasion techniques where they scarcity and lack and things like that in the buyer, where they think, well, we're also shopping it up to XYZ and Acme company and what have you. And I mean, you're not the only one at the table here, right? And we're not in the once you get to a certain point in the negotiation, it goes exclusive, right? Where once you get to a certain point, you have to agree to them for 90 days. You'll only talk to them. Right. They earn their way to that point. They give you I think some metrics in terms of like minimums and what have you. But it's enough for you to lock in and sign an exclusive arrangement. So where that company can then freely work with you for 90 days to come up with a deal before you can reshop it out to one of the competitors. Right. Yeah. And that whole process, of course, was highly explained, by the broker as well. Right. So, and then the other part of the deal that the broker helped educate us, but also as part of the negotiation and the learning for myself was do you take cash? Do you take shares, right? Do you take a combination? Do you take a job with them, or do you sort of like take the money and run, right? Yeah. And so there's a myriad, answers to that question, right? Depending upon your situation, but for the most part, like we were about a 40-person company, and and we'd had some very successful years, meaning it was a good exit, but they're not going to just let you take the money and run, right? They want you to stay for a few years. Well,
they're always worried, I guess, if you're going to just take the money and run, they're like, what skeletons are in the cupboard that they're trying to run away from? Yeah.
So you have to negotiate, how much you'll roll in and how much you'll take out, But the nice thing about this transaction was it was essentially an all cash deal, though, in the sense that they weren't really issuing shares, although there were some shares as part of the roll-in transaction, but it was a cash deal. The other negotiation that I alluded to, the short story is quite simple, is that this was 15 years before that. And after I ran that company for 15 years, but I sold it to a public company, and I agreed to take mostly shares in that public company. Yeah. And because I was an insider with so many shares, I couldn't sell them. I couldn't sell them for at least the first 90 days. Then I could only sell 1% every 90 days, and for the first 2 or 3 years. And so essentially you can't sell any shares, right? In plain simple terms, right? And what ended up happening was these were kind of I didn't do the proper due diligence. They were doing due diligence on us, but I didn't do due diligence on them.
Which is interesting, isn't it? Because effectively you were buying into them.
Exactly. Yeah. Which I didn't even understand that at the time. I just thought, and they were, again, it was the same kind of business, and they had some really fancy assets that looked good on paper. Right. And, or as we like to say, good from far, far from good. Right. And,
I like that one.
Yeah. And so we kind of got sucked in, and we took these shares. And to make a long story short, of course, we had to stay working there as well. They ended up closing down our division, and we all had, were sort of out of work. And then ultimately the shares kind of reduced to almost zero. So, on paper, I became a multimillionaire with all these shares in this business, and then I had a job working for them. And then within 18 months of the transaction, the shares were worthless, and I needed to go go get a job. Now people saying, how did you live through that? Right. Because, how did you survive, becoming a millionaire and then losing it all? I go, I didn't lose anything.
It was just paper.
It was just paper. Right.
Yeah. So, but I think, and I really appreciate that you've shared that story, because I think a lot of people, take an example like that and they want to sort of hide it. They don't want to make it known. But I think unless people talk about these sort of scenarios, it's really easy for others to come along and make the same mistake, because, as you said, I mean, the thought that I'm selling something, but I still need to do due diligence, because in that case, you are not just selling, you are selling and buying.
Exactly.
I think it's such an important thing, because, particularly, a lot of my work is in the small business sector, and things get done in all sorts of different ways. And they're probably less likely to have this sort of share buyout, but there's often that component where you are still reliant on the other side. So, the earn-out clause is probably the biggest one that comes up, that I see disputes around, where they've sold out of the business, but the part of the purchase price is dependent on future earnings. And, I did one dispute where it was a cafe. So it was a small business cafe. The minute the new owner took it over, they changed the name, they changed the menu, and the vendor was complaining, going, hang on, I should have got all this earn-out, but they've reduced the revenue because they've totally changed this cafe into something that it wasn't, and nobody wants to go there anymore. So everything that they thought that they'd earn from the earn-out was gone.
Oh yeah, that's the earn-out is a huge part of the negotiation actually as well, and fortunately we hit our earn-out, so that's a good thing on the second deal. And but the funny thing is that 2022 was such a banner year in telecom in North America that we kind of hit. Not only did we hit our earn-out, but we blew it out of the water. And I mean, there wasn't a lot of calculation in it to see, can we go back and negotiate?
Can we have the goal, and then the big, hairy, audacious goal that we can get a little bit more for?
Yeah. So, so we really, they were really happy with the transaction, of course, how it worked out. And 2023 in North America for telecom is not quite such a great story, right? It's a far more subdued market this year. And the carriers are spending a lot less this year. They're holding back because of the interest rates and things. And so, they got the good last year, and this year they have to ride out the storm while we get through to the next phase of spending, right? And
there you go. So you can just rejoice that it wasn't a 2-year
exactly. Yeah, exactly.
So perhaps we can talk a little bit more. Tell me, I mentioned your book earlier.
Yeah.
What drove you to write a book about sales negotiations?
So, so I started selling. I worked for the federal government in Canada. I worked for the weather service, and I was fixing electronic stuff. And my boss basically told me to get out of the government, and he said, you should become a salesperson, right? I guess, I don't know, something about the way I spoke or what have you, but I took him at his word, and I went and got into sales. I got a job in a company selling the kind of equipment that I was using in the government, high ticket electronic instruments for the most part. And I started to notice from the owners of that company and my coworkers, and they all sort of formed a team of mentors in terms of me coming up to speed as a salesperson, that they followed patterns and rules. They hadn't really written them down or anything, but I noticed them repeating themselves. Right. And, I would find myself in awe at times at some of these rules and techniques that these guys would follow, and how well they worked and how simple they are. And I started writing them down. And then there were some rules that I decided I didn't want to follow, right? Meaning, don't do that, don't do that, right? And so I started naming them after the people, and I wrote them in this book, and I kept the book. And over the years, I just kept writing sort of as I like to say it, the punchline and the name of the person that it was associated with, enough that I could recant the story. Then I started telling the stories to some people back in the 80s and 90s. And then they would end up telling some people, and, oh, Glenn told me this. And I ended up speaking at other sales sales companies sharing these stories and what have you. And then people are like, oh, you should write a book. And I'm like, yeah, I should write a book. And of course, I never did write a book, and then all these years went by, 30 years, as a matter of fact. And then the pandemic came, right? And I had always been inkling about, I'd love to write the book and, bucket list and all that, right? But and in Canada, similar to yourself, I'm sure the lockdowns were pretty severe, right? Like we didn't go anywhere and we didn't do anything, right? And although my warehouse and office had to stay open for our customers, I went to work and opened the warehouse with my warehouse staff, and I went back home every night, right? And that was it, right? And so on the weekends, nothing to do, nowhere to go, and I thought, hey, I can maybe do this. So I started Googling how to write a book, and I decided that I was going to, as I like to tell the story, I was going to write 2,000 words every weekend until I got to the proper length. And I looked it up on Google, of course, and it said 75,000 words. So I wrote until I got to 75,000 words. And then I sent it to an editor, right? And it was a lady, and she sent it back. She says, Glenn, you can't swear that much in a book, right? And I'm like, okay. And I go, that's just the way I talk. And when I tell these stories, right? And she's like, no, you got to get rid of some of that. And I'm like, okay, why don't we agree on 71,000 words? And so that's what we did, right? I'm just teasing a bit, but it ended up coming in around 71,000 words minus any of the profanity, and made it safe for work, and and so it was actually a lot easier than writing it was actually a lot easier than any other part of it, right? Because all the stories took 30 years.
This is a book that's 30 years in the making. It's it's fantastic. And the thing that I just love this idea that you've talked about, where you've had a book and you've made a note of these things, because one of the things that I say, if you want to become a better negotiator, it's actually reflecting on what's happened in the negotiations that you've been part of or that you've watched. And what you've really been doing for 30 years is reflecting on the negotiations around you. And just that process of reflecting and writing it down helps to keep it in your head. And so even if you didn't want to write a book, I think that process of making those notes is a fantastic thing to do.
Right. Yeah. And so I ended up, I came up with a fancy title that I thought was great. And another kind of editor said that title sucks, and that's not going to work, and Amazon won't like it, and so that this other lady, she said she picked a title of one of my chapters, right? Never sit in the lobby, and it's basically one of the rules, right? And I thought, oh yeah, that's what a good idea, right? And so that became the title, and the subtitle is 57 factors on how to build a business and grow a career in sales, and it's basically all the rules, but the short story is that it's basically how I created a company where the customers where we're a pleasure to do business with at all times. That's the mantra of our business. It's not a published statement. It's our internal mantra of we will always want to be a pleasure to do business with, even during the difficult times when there's problems. And there's many stories in the book, that talk about, picking up the phone, even when it's difficult, right? And that those are when the impressions are made with customers.
Do you ever feel stuck in a negotiation or conflict? You're not quite sure what the next step should be? Friends and colleagues may give advice, but perhaps they're only seeing things from your side. My new negotiation GP service is for exactly that situation. You can book a short, standard or long consultation where we will explore your situation using a systematic approach. You will walk away with concrete steps to follow and an increased confidence to manage the situation. To learn more, head to my website at nicoledavidsonnegotiation.com.au, where you can book a consultation online. Don't forget, I also offer one-on-one coaching, team training, and expert advice on specific negotiations. My tailored approach is designed to meet your specific needs, and my proven methodologies and strategies are grounded in the latest research and best practices. So whether you're a small business owner, a corporate executive, or anyone in between, let me help you achieve your negotiation goals and maximize your success.
Not when the times are good and they're issuing a PO. Obviously, you're going to pick up the phone, right?
Yeah.
But when the units break and salespeople want to cower behind their desk and like get somebody else to phone the customer back and don't want to deal with it. Those are the biggest mistakes people make in their career, right? And because when you service a customer, that's when they learn to appreciate you as a supplier, right? And,
Totally. So I'm really interested then, because that's something that comes up a lot. One of the reasons that conflict arises in business is because people have gone into hiding when things go wrong.
Right.
Either they don't pick up the phone and they just email, or they just go quiet completely. Are there any stories in the book that talk about how do you get the confidence to do that?
Yeah. So it's funny what you just said about the email thing. One of the chapters, again, it's not really a bad word, but it's a little bad. It's called, one of the chapters at the beginning is called Never Fax the Facts and Never Ship the Shit. Right. And so, and of course, as I was, people were teasing me after the book came out. I was like, you talk about fax machines, like you're dating yourself. And I'm like, well, if you read the whole chapter, you'll realize that I talk about emails as well and phone calls. And I'm saying what I mean is don't electronically transmit information to a customer when you need to deliver it face to face. And if you need to deliver a product, don't FedEx it or UPS it to the customer, hand deliver it. And if it's a piece of equipment, for instance, because we sell high ticket items, right?
Yeah.
Not only deliver it, but make sure you're there when they're setting it up and make sure they know how to work it and that you're there a few days later to make sure they're still using it, right? Because the unseasoned salesperson or business person will basically fax the facts. I say to a sales guy, did you send them the quote? And they go, oh yeah. And I go, what did they say? And I go, well, I emailed it. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, did you follow up? And they're like, well, yeah, but you didn't answer the phone. I left a voicemail. And I'm like, okay, so it's $100,000 item. You've emailed the quote, not connected, phoned them and left a voicemail. They didn't phone you back. Like, where do you think you sit in the world of closing this deal? Right. And he's like, well, they just asked for a quote. Like, what do I do? And I have all these rules in the book. And so usually at that point, I'll say, look, just show up and make sure you have something in your hand and something in your mind. Yeah. Right. And they're like, well, what do you mean by that? I said, look, the guy asked for a quote, deliver the quote, hand deliver the quote, and, and phone him up, tell him you're going to be in their area tomorrow and you want to drop it off. Oh, but what if he says he's too busy? Then tell him, look, you'll leave it for him in the lobby. So he called the guy and he said, oh, I'm too busy. Can I just leave it in the lobby? He goes, yeah, leave it in the lobby, but I'm really busy. And then the next day, of course, you show up and I tell him, in that case, show up early in the morning and show up with a dozen donuts and the quote, right? And and in Canada, we love our donuts, right? Tim Hortons donuts but never bring donuts after 10:30. And because then you just spoil the guy's lunch and then he gets mad at you again, right? And so again, these are all little rules that I make, right? And so when you're in the lobby, you phone the guy from the lobby phone or get the receptionist. The receptionist says, well, is he expecting you? And you're like, well, yeah, he asked me to drop off a quote. Right. And so then they call the guy up. The guy forgot that he told you he was too busy to come down and get it. 90% of the time he comes down, you've got something in your hand. You can give it to him. You got the donuts, which make him happy. Yeah. You show him the quote and say, hey, what do you think? And then go to the next rule in the book, which is always ask for a mini tour. And so then at that point, the guy and everyone's like, what's a mini tour? And I said, well, a mini tour is like a tour that's mini. Right. And they're like, what do you mean?
Pretty complicated stuff.
Yeah. Right. And they go, come on, what do you mean? I'm like, look, have you ever gone on a trip and you sign up for the tour of the city and it's 4 hours and you realize you don't like the people on the bus and, tours can be a pain. Right. But a mini tour is mini and it's just, you want to see their new lab. You want to see their new office, their new building, their new parking lot, their new warehouse, their new, whatever is appropriate to what you sell.
But right? I'm guessing that that's not about actually seeing the facilities or the business. It's actually about having time with this person to build rapport and build relationship.
It is. And the next rule is never forget a face. So when you're in the parking lot, before you walk and never sit in the lobby, the name of the book, you go to your phone and you look up every person's name and you move their face from distant memory into front memory. And so that, there might be 6 or 7 people, at that customer from the past transactions, and you go back and remember their names, right? And their faces, I mean. And if you don't remember their face, go to LinkedIn and look at their photo.
Yeah.
And then when you're walking back to see the new lab or warehouse or whatever, you're like, oh, hey, Sally, hey, Bob, and they're like, who's that guy again? And this guy's thinking, oh my God, this guy knows everybody, right? And when you finally do get to the location where you're going, you're going to find out, hey, is my item one of 3 other items that they're looking at? Does it have dust on it? Did they open the box? Are they using it? Are they just exercising me to get a quote and they really want to buy somebody else? These are all the things you find out on the mini tour. Yep. Plus you get to reestablish connections with all those people and establish, credibility. Right. And people are like, well, everyone else knows Glenn. Maybe I should deal with Glenn. Right.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the ways that I use to get, as I like to say, get, act, and stay in front of the customer. Right.
Yeah, I like that. And you know what, I'm going to put this one out for everyone to remember is I love that quote that you said, just show up and make sure you have something in your hands and something in your head. Absolutely love it. Are there any other, just mindful of the time, in terms of what are the number 1 or 2 things that you think people need to think about going into a sales negotiation?
The one master rule that I have for everybody is you only get forever to make another impression. So always be making a good impression. Yeah. And people kind of get a little confused by the, wait a minute, my mom told me that, but she actually said you got to make a good first impression. And I'm like, that's right. And a good second impression, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. And I said, I tell the story about the boss pulling into the parking lot and you hear his sports car. And the moment that happens, you got to be the best worker in that building, right? You want to be 100% working on a project. When he walks by, say, hey, boss, you got a second? I have a question for you. You always want to be, being your best self when you're in front of customers and coworkers, and especially people above you that can control how your career will evolve. Because whether you like it or not, some people go, oh, I don't know, Glenn, like you're kind of exaggerating or whatever. And I'm like, dude, whether you like it or not, you're making an impression. Yeah. So you might as well make it a good impression, right? If he sees you, like one of the stories I like to tell is that if he sees you on Facebook and you alt tab over the CRM, as you hear him, he's going to notice that. And then he sees you do it again. At that point, you're a bum, right? Yeah. There's no coming back from that, right? Whatever the first impression was, it's been diluted. So always make a good impression. And, and when faced with adversity, always take action, right? Don't move to a position of fear and retreat, right? So many times people want to cower and bring in the boss, or charge forward when you're faced with adversity, because that's really when the biggest differences are made and the most gains are made. Yes. Like in your business and things like that. Like when you're the most scared and the most challenged, by pushing through those things, that's usually where the value in your business ends up escalating and going through the roof, right? Well, that's the differentiator, isn't it? Because so many people do not handle those situations well. If you can do that well, you're well ahead of the pack. Exactly. Yeah. What a great piece of advice to round that off on. I've really enjoyed chatting. Glenn, if people wanted to get a hold of the book or if they wanted to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that? So I have a website. It's glennpoulos.com, and everything is linked there. There's some, free sort of giveaways on some negotiating things, how to do a great presentation, which I call the punch, perfect, pitch, and close. And also links to the book and my social. I'm very active on LinkedIn. If they want to connect to me, I'm happy to talk to them there. And I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. Fantastic. And I'll put all of those details in the show notes for the listeners as well. Once again, Glenn, it's been a great conversation. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks for having me. That's all for this episode of the Negotiation in Real Life podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and learned something new that you can apply in your own negotiations. Remember, negotiation is a skill that can be developed and refined over time, so keep practicing and pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please don't hesitate to reach out. You can find us on social media or email us directly. And if you liked this episode, please leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It helps us to reach more people and continue to produce high-quality content. Until next time, keep negotiating in real life.